Hey church, Pastor Shane here with another community group discussion starter video. This week we continued in our series out of the book of Genesis following Joseph's life, the Joseph story arc in the book of Genesis that we're calling God Meant It for Good. And this week was all about waiting. And I don't know if you've been through this waiting. Maybe you'll start talking about this. Have you been through a season of long waiting on God for Him to change your situation, for maybe some situation to end, for something to begin for you? Maybe it's either a season of difficulty or a season where you're waiting for maybe a season of good to come. That might be a great opening question for you to kind of talk about, to start thinking about like, well, what are the different situations where I find myself really waiting on God? And to be clear, that is what we are talking about in the text in chapters 40 and 41 that we were in this week, that it's not just waiting in general. It's not just waiting for something to happen or for something to change. It's waiting on God to do something. It's waiting on God to change something. It's waiting on God to work in us or around us or through us or whatever it is. It's really focused on waiting on God, and that's really what you're going to be discussing today. We got to that point by opening up the text and looking at, three ideas on waiting that we learned from the Joseph story. The first is that God is always working. Throughout the Joseph story, we see God working in the background, that He is working slowly to bring Joseph to this place where Joseph, who is sold into slavery, becomes the prime minister of Egypt. It's wild. And throughout the story, his invisible hand is kind of working out circumstances, or maybe even working in and training Joseph for his future. And so in our seasons of waiting, we want to remember that God is always working. The second thing we talked about is the fact that waiting for us is an active practice, not a passive experience. That waiting is an active practice, not a passive experience. That during waiting, we're not just sitting back twiddling our thumbs. We're not just waiting and passively for God to do something. That we're seeking God, we're exploring Him, we're learning, we're growing. That we continue to live our Christian lives, that we continue to build community, that we continue to do all the things that we do in our Christian life during that time of waiting. Because if God is working, and if He's truly working in us, then we want to respond to that in the way we live our life. That often the seasons of waiting is a time of growing our faith. Or maybe it's a time for us to learn something. And if we're just sitting back passively, just kind of waiting for it to end, then we miss out on all those opportunities that God would have to grow in us. And I would say this even, don't let your season of waiting go to waste. Continue to seek God, explore, learn, develop, grow, reach out to your community group, bless others as you share your faith or your struggles with them. Waiting is not something to just be sitting back. It's something to continue to be pursuing God and pursuing godliness and pursuing our life of faith. And last, we talked about the fact that when it comes to waiting, that when we can't see God's hand at work, that we can still trust His heart. To trust God's heart when we can't see His hand actually working. Because just like in the Joseph story, we don't know ahead of time what God is going to do or what's going to happen or how things are going to turn out. But we can trust in the person and character of God. And if we could keep that in mind, His goodness, His justice, His faithfulness, His mercy, His grace to us, then we endure, then we actually grow, then we trust His character, even if we don't quite understand the circumstances that we are in. I hope you'll share about your waiting. Maybe you're in that season now, maybe you remember that season in the past, and encourage each other with those stories of how God has been faithful, how God meant it for good. Have a great conversation.